We have with us now Dr. John Concato, who is the Associate Director for Real-World Evidence Analytics in the Office of Medical Policy at the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the FDA. I've asked him to come talk about that framework, kind of where things stand and what's going to happen next. Prior to joining the FDA in 2019, Dr. Concato's career focused on generating research as an independent investigator and research center director at Yale University School of Medicine in the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. So, Dr. Concato, I want to thank you very much for coming and turn the floor over to you.
Thank you for inviting me. And since you covered what's on the title slide here, I'll move on to start by saying that obviously the views and opinions expressed today are mine and should not be attributed to the FDA. I'm not here to make policy, and no conflicts of interest exist related to this presentation. And a final note, you will notice some overlap with Mark McClellan's presentation. I'll try to point that out, but hopefully it'll be apparent along the way. It's highly concordant. But let's start with what might be the public perception of medical evidence. This is today's random medical news, if you haven't seen this cartoon before, from the New England Journal of Panic-Inducing Gobbledygook. So according to a report released today, spin the wheel, coffee can cause depression in twins. We might chuckle at this, but we understand oops, is this on auto advance? We understand where this is coming from. So what I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes is go through discussing terms for study design commonly used in drug development. Mark touched on that already. Describe FDA's real-world evidence program. Again, Mark did a very nice job of highlighting it. And then really, I'm going to back up in a way, sort of a big picture view to highlight the intersection of scientific and legal regulatory issues related to study design in the real-world evidence era. And I might say that's a source of confusion right now. And then I'll wrap up by providing some examples of real-world evidence in drug approvals. So to start with, and I'll try to make this brief because Mark covered it, but this is from just past the turn of the century. These are sort of traditional terms for study design. Now we're only talking about patient-oriented research, not laboratory research. By primary studies, I mean this is not meta-analysis, but if we can think of it from the 30,000-foot view, descriptive studies such as case reports or case series don't have a comparison arm, right? So there's limited amount of information you can get from it other than say, I don't know, insulin for the first time to reduce blood glucose, which by the way is almost to the day 100 years ago that was done with a single beagle dog. But most of the time, as Mark said, our effect sizes are smaller. So on the right-hand side, cause-effect studies benefit from a control or comparator group where you could say, well, how do patients do who didn't get the drug of interest? And very generally, you could divide this into two categories, so-called observational studies on the left at the bottom, and experimental studies, which would be the true converse on the right. So observational studies, the drug of interest is given in the course of clinical care, whereas in an experimental study, there's a protocol that says, well, I'm going to give this drug because I want to learn about what it does. For all practical purposes, we talk about randomized controlled trials. We don't bother to say experiment. On the left-hand side, cross-sectional studies have a limited role because there isn't that longitudinality to say what happened after I took a drug today. Something happened to me today, it might not be the drug. But observational cohort studies and case control studies you have undoubtedly heard about. I mention this just to set the landscape. Now, what most of the time we focus on is the contrast between this first slide and the next slide. This is a cause-effect or a drug outcome association, where the schematic shows patients at baseline, they receive a drug or a comparator drug, and then we evaluate the outcome. Now, if this is a randomized trial setting, we randomize them to either the drug of interest of the comparator. And what's important here is when we ask the question, is the validity of the comparison affected by sources of methodologic bias? Randomization promotes balance at baseline. So as we know, those compared groups are quite similar. And that should go a long way towards minimizing bias. And for decades, this has been the preferred method for evaluating drug safety and efficacy. Although, as we've heard, safety has had more than a randomized trial approach over the years, but efficacy less so. So this scenario stands in contrast to a second scenario where, without randomization, we have the same patients at some baseline state. They then receive a drug or a comparator drug, but for reasons that clinicians are using their best judgment to help the patient. And then we have an evaluation of outcome. When we ask the question, is the validity of this comparison affected by sources of methodologic bias? We see that observational studies need to address various potential imbalances without randomization in order to minimize bias. So for example, doctors using their best judgment could preferentially give a drug to patients who are more likely or less likely to have, a better outcome. So in that sense, there are an awful lot of things that have to go right in a so-called observational study to get a valid answer to the question about whether the association that's observed is true or not. With that as background, another relevant aspect of, say, the past several decades in the era of evidence-based medicine, before we got to the era of big data, are hierarchies of study design, what might be called simplistic hierarchies of study design, which are often described as overly simplistic categories of hierarchies, of study design. Basically, they evolved in the 1990s, and the bottom line is, as you've heard, randomized controlled trials are the gold standard. Now, if you combine gold, you still have gold or perhaps platinum, but the main point here is that as you go down, you're going to less rigorous designs. But what had evolved was the idea that not only are those other designs not as good, but they are inherently not trustworthy. And that's not just a subtle difference. That makes a lot of difference in terms of research in general and drug development and regulatory assessments as well. And just to highlight sort of this point, I'm choosing almost bookends, 180 degrees apart. This article from a year ago said the magic of randomization versus the myth of real-world evidence. Because of the potential biases in observational studies, such studies cannot generally be trusted. The replacement of randomized trials with non-randomized observational analyses is a false solution to the serious problem of ensuring that patients receive treatments that are both safe and effective. Now, this is representative. I don't mean to single out this one paper or these one set of authors. Similarly, on the opposite end of the opinion spectrum, by Angus Deaton and Nancy Cartwright, misunderstanding randomized trials. I should say this is not about drug development per se or drug development alone, but they said, quote, "We argue that any special status for randomized controlled trials is unwarranted. Which method is likely to yield a good causal inference depends on what we are trying to discover, as well as on what is already known." I'm not trying to be provocative, but I would say that the distribution is such that most folks are in the middle, trying to figure out what works where and what doesn't work. But nonetheless, you should be aware, as you may already be, about this sort of divergent opinions from time to time. Now, before moving on, there are so many topics to possibly cover, but when observational studies and randomized trials are compared, very often another issue of generalizability is mentioned. And generalizability is also known as external validity in contrast to internal validity, which is whether the study itself got the answer right for the patients it was looking at. And I'm here literally quoting from two prominent scientists from past decades who say, first, Cochrane, between measurements based on RCTs and benefit in the community, there is a gulf which has been much underestimated. And Austin Bradford Hill of the Hill criteria, at its best, the trial shows what can be accomplished with the medicine under careful observation and certain restricted conditions. The same results will not invariably or necessarily be observed when the medicine passes into general use. So this is an advantage, so to speak, for observational studies, but I want to be clear that there's a separate question of does the drug work at all, which is what internal validity is about. So you could have two drugs that are equally internally valid, but one of them might be more generally applicable. And this is often, by the way, also called the distinction between efficacy and effectiveness, with effectiveness pointing to generalizability. If there are any questions about that, and I cannot see the question box at this point, but I'm happy to go in further. But I want to mention that because I think it's relevant, but not inherent to what I was asked to talk about. But here's where, let's now fast forward. It's not as if what I'm about to show on this slide have replaced the old terms, but more and more you'll see the term interventional study as almost being synonymous with clinical trial. It's a study in which patients are assigned to one or more treatment groups, again, according to a protocol to evaluate the effects of a treatment of interest on subsequent outcomes. So it's not only randomized controlled trials with a comparator arm, but a single arm trial, if you have a protocol, even though it doesn't have its own accompanied comparison arm, it might reach for a historical control, et cetera. It is still an interventional study. That's in contrast to a non-interventional study, AKA observational study, in which patients are not assigned to a study arm according to a protocol, but instead receive the drug of interest during routine medical practice. So observational cohort studies, as I showed you earlier, that's where you start at baseline and you follow forward. A case control study is the same general idea, but it has quote unquote backward directionality that shouldn't have negative connotations. Rather, you identify patients based on their health outcomes, who lived and who died, and then who got what drug previously, antecedent drug use, and you could also make a valid inference regarding cause-effect associations under the right circumstances. And then if that's not somewhat complicated enough, you have combined interventional and non-interventional designs and other designs that they don't have time to get into. An externally controlled trial is where you have a clinical trial arm, an interventional study arm, and an arm from another data source. And actually, Mark McClellan alluded to some of those with his 54, in some cases, very early, quote unquote, RWE approvals. I say RWE because notice I've barely mentioned that term up until now. And I do want to pivot to the real world evidence program at FDA. And again, I can recoup some time because Mark did a great job of describing it. But as he mentioned, the 21st Century Cures Act, it mandated that FDA shall establish a program to evaluate the potential use, which you're doing sincerely and earnestly. But notice it's to support a new indication for a drug already approved. So to get back to some of the conversation in the 9 a.m. hour, if a drug's not approved yet, we're not going to use real world data. It's not on the market. So how can we sort of know what it's doing? And also to satisfy post-approval study requirements. There are some exceptions to that first bullet, but we could talk about that later. The draft framework was to be issued by December 18. That did happen. And Mark had a slide on it. I do as well. But it describes sources of real world evidence, challenges, pilot opportunities. Draft guidance to be issued. Mark had a slide where he showed the guidances that are on our list to be published. And he also talked about the Prescription Drug User Fee Act. I will emphasize the last bullet, the first part of that last bullet. The standard for substantial evidence remains unchanged. In that sense, I might quibble with the title of this entire half-day session. It's not how big data is changing scientific standards with a capital S, at least from the FDA point of view. It's how can big data / real world evidence reach the criterion, meet the high bar of substantial evidence. More about that shortly. But here, I won't belabor this because this is the FDA definition, which Mark also showed, and it's pretty well accepted. Real world data come from a variety of sources, not from clinical trials, but then with that definition, real world evidence is the clinical evidence obtained from the analysis of real world data. And importantly, in a yellow font, it does include randomized trials, but not in the traditional sense, but rather if they're large, simple trials, if they're pragmatic trials that by definition use real world data as opposed to all protocol-driven collected at bricks and mortar sites data. So with that, again, I think Mark had a somewhat similar slide. I will point out it's more than a technicality. This is for the Center for Drugs and the Center for Biologics. The Center for Devices, to its credit, has its own guidance and understandably has its own guidance. Our regs are slightly different. In terms of our approach, it can be generally described in 4 bins or categories. We have internal processes to make sure we're doing the right thing in-house. We have external stakeholder engagement to hear from sponsors, stakeholders, patient groups, and others. We have guidance development, as was covered. And really, I think Sebastian Schneeweiss et al. And the subsequent Michelle Johnson-Funk, sorry, if I start naming names, Dr. Nielsen, I'll have to name everyone, but they'll be going into detail on one of the demonstration projects, but we have upwards of 20. We're trying to plant seeds such that the field grows in terms of knowing better about data, about design, and even about regulatory approaches and pure methodologic approaches, say to causal inference, which we'll hear about late in the day. All right, so now let's pivot to sort of, again, the big picture view part. Let's highlight the intersection of some scientific and legal regulatory issues. What's new about real world data, real world evidence? Well, to answer that question, I offer the perspective of, well, what's changed? And what's changed is improved access and rapid analysis of information in the era of big data, research showing that observational studies can generate results similar to RCTs, the 21st Century Cures Act, as just mentioned, and other factors that, are not being exhaustive here. But again, I alluded to this. There is confusion right now because of non-specific use of the terms real-world data and real-world evidence. So quickly, these are informal comments on big data. The term appeared in the computer science literature around the 1990s. It often referred to data at that time too large to be stored in then conventional storage systems. Mark had that slide of how far we've come. Contemporary usage, at least in one person's opinion from a few years ago, it's unclear when big data became the buzzword of the day or really what it means actually. But one perspective is that modern technology has increased the quantity and forms of data as well as the speed to merge and manipulate it. Yet integration and analysis of large scale data has always been integral to epidemiology. So is this really, is this exceptionalism? Is it just, well, we used to have a lot of paper, now we have a lot of electrons. It's certainly true that it's a lot more to look at, but what fundamentally has changed? Secondly, the research on observational studies. This was from 2000, a comparison of the observational studies and randomized controlled trials. The conclusion was we found little evidence that estimates of treatment effects in observational studies reported after 1994 are either consistently larger than or qualitatively different from those obtained in RCTs. Similarly, the results of well-designed observational studies with either a cohort or case control design do not systematically overestimate the magnitude of effects of treatment as compared with those in RCTs on the same topic. Fast forward, I'll try to move quickly here. This is from 2014, the same focus. This is the Cochrane Collaboration, which is well known for doing systematic reviews. It's also well known for having a quote unquote pro-randomized trial bent, if you will. And they found on average, there is little evidence for significant effect estimate differences between the two types of studies, and factors other than study design per se need to be considered when exploring reasons for a lack of agreement. So the last of this series of slides is just comments on real world evidence. The origin of real world evidence, real world as a modifier is highly nonspecific. And you can find real world data or real world evidence in the medical literature as of the 1970s or earlier, but in very disparate contexts. So right now, what's really changed is we have regulatory definitions that are formal. So one perspective is that the older epidemiologic terms were just fine. They were sufficient, but the emergence of big data and 21st century cures and other factors has led to different taxonomies for study design. So one take-home point is a real-world evidence study does not automatically always equal an observational study. You need more details if you want to classify study design if the need arises. In the interest of time, I won't talk about this very much as to say we tried to help by publishing not that long ago the FDA perspective, but the main novelty here for purposes of this morning's discussion is randomized trial versus observational study as a dichotomy is overly simplistic. Sometimes it works as shorthand, but sometimes it can get one into trouble. I'm going to move on just to update since I talked about this before. If we go to contemporary, if I've been effective in my presentation, you'll appreciate that non-interventional studies largely align with observational, interventional with experimental, AKA randomized controlled trial. But the problem is real world evidence can be either. So you have to be careful. And this slide actually is sort of not a cheat sheet, but rather if you wanted one slide to look at to say, where are we now? I'll have to be brief, but we see on the top, randomized interventional, non-randomized interventional, and non-randomized non-interventional. Sorry for the word salad, but we do see on the left that traditional randomized trials even can use real world data in the background to assess enrollment, to support site selection. But as you move to the middle, that's where you get what might be called more substantial real world data in the randomized controlled trial. A single arm trial with an external control is moving to the right. And then finally, what folks sometimes think of when they hear real world evidence is an observational cohort study. But let me wrap up here. Actually, Mark showed this slide about real world data being fit for use. This is our approach to evaluating real world evidence, whether the trial or study design can generate adequate evidence and whether the conduct meets regulatory requirements. Mark also talked about the federal regulations for adequate and well-controlled studies. You could read this on the slide set later, but basically, how do we determine that substantial evidence exists? Usually it's from traditional randomized trials because we know how that controls for bias and chance, but observational methods are being evaluated. So here's where the good news is Mark talked about this. He itemized them and counted them. What this first slide is up to is attempting to show is that even before we didn't call this real world evidence at the time. We're looking back and designating it as such. but from 2010 on, we have several examples of real-world evidence approvals. This slide is in the 21st century cures era, and again, it shows real-world evidence. By the time we get to Ibrance at the bottom, for men with breast cancer, this did get a lot of quote-unquote press about the use of real-world evidence, but interestingly, the evidence there was not the adequate and well-controlled, it was supportive evidence. The actual evidence that got this approval over the finish line were the randomized trials in women. So this is a somewhat complex topic to talk about, and hopefully this presentation is helping in that regard. Chris, I'll look at you. I think I should go fast since we're at 10:22, but is that a fair assessment on my part?
Yeah, if anybody has a question, raise your hand, or put it in the Q&A right now. Otherwise, you keep talking for a few more minutes, and then I'll interrupt you when it's time.
Okay, well then if I have a minute or two, just to contrast two approvals to give you a sense of that, if it's not complexity of the structure involved. This is blinatumomab, which was on my first slide, approved in 2014. The drug is as named, the disease is leukemia, and the design is an externally controlled trial. So this is in our regs. It's real world evidence, but we didn't have to have the era of big data real world evidence to do this. The drug was studied in a single arm clinical trial with a protocol, and the bad outcome occurred in 43% of 189 patients. What happened there is the results were compared to historical data, which we now call real world data, extracted from sites in Europe and the US, and they went out of their way. These are the guts of the methods, right? This is where they use weighted analysis and propensity scores to balance the compared populations, and they found the complete remission only occurred in, I'm sorry, this is, the complete remission in 24%. So I was incorrect before when they talked about the bad outcome. This is a good outcome with the bad disease. So 43% did well, whereas only 24% did well among 694 patients. And on this basis, the FDA approved the drug for the specific indication that's shown on that last bullet. But the main point here is this is an externally controlled trial that relied on an interventional study for substantial evidence. Contrast that to a new indication just approved last week for Prograf, tacrolimus, based on real world evidence. So it had been previously approved for organ rejection in patients receiving liver and later kidney and heart organ transplants based on randomized controlled trial evidence, and for various reasons, the RCTs were never done for lung transplant, but the drug was widely used in clinical care. The sponsor submitted a supplemental new drug application with a non-interventional study design. We evaluated the data and design according to FDA standards, and we approved the new indication last Friday. The point here, to tie it back to what I've been talking about, is the data came from a real world data source, a registry of all transplant recipients in the US. It actually goes back further than 1999, but that's the data they used. The design was a non-interventional observational treatment arm compared to historical controls. We determined that the non-interventional study with the controls was adequate and well controlled. And in part, and Mark McClellan mentioned this as well, given that the outcome of organ rejection and death is virtually certain to occur without therapy, the dramatic results of the effectiveness of treatment, better than 90% organ, non-organ rejection and survival at 1 year, is so dramatic that we're much less concerned about sources of bias than would occur in other contexts. So with that, I'll wrap up and say that older terms to study design and drug development are now joined by newer terms describing the same inherent designs. Our FDA real world evidence program is advancing as outlined in our framework. New and sometimes confusing terminology, such as Mark said, randomized trials can generate real world evidence, can be linked back to the emergence of big data and the regulatory legislative changes. And I just want to leave you with the thought that randomized trials versus observational studies, as you heard, can be problematic. And we, should be clear, approve drugs using real world evidence, but in various ways. And some implications are that clear and consistent use of terminology can advance understanding and promote progress. This is what we really tell stakeholders as well as ourselves in the current era of real world evidence. All study designs have strengths and limitations. So analyses involving real world data and real world evidence just have to be recognized for having distinctive attributes that we really have to focus on. Ongoing efforts can help to identify factors in those attributes to help promote generation of valid real world evidence, which is what we all want to promote the public health. And an important point, these alternative study designs, real world evidence, if you will, we are emphatic about this. They should supplement and not replace traditional clinical trials for regulatory decision making. It should be the right tool for the job at the time and place, not that real world evidence is going to be done because, I don't know, it's less expensive. It only can be done when it makes sense from an overall point of view. And with that, I'll finish and say thank you very much. I'll look for questions. And if there are any questions after the session, this is a mailbox in the Real World Evidence Office of Medical Policy Department that can be used going forward for any and all topics. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much. And if you have a question for Dr. Concato, put it in the Q&A right now or raise your hand. I have a question on, you mentioned the 21st Century Cures Act, which is a few years old now. And you said at the time it was intended, or they specified, consider the use of real world evidence in new indications for already approved drugs. Is that right? Yeah. Since then, has there been pressure or been a move to, from Congress to actually have you, to ask you to consider it for new drug applications?
Well, I'll let Congress speak for itself. I think I would characterize the situation in answering your question is that we haven't seen as much uptake on what the 21st Century Cures Act was focused on as one might imagine, to sort of put a lot of pressure on your question. In other words, the next step. And I'm not faulting anyone. I think I'll speak on behalf of FDA that we have honored our commitment to put forward a framework. And again, guidance development is in the pipeline. It won't be one single guidance, but rather a series of guidance to try to itemize data design and even subcategories within that. I think it's just the learning curve. We're at an inflection point. I won't blame sponsors either, but sometimes, to be blunt, the applications we see fall so far short of the fit for data, is the design adequate, and regulatory conduct that, it's not approvable. Now, having said that, we didn't approve Prograf because we needed to. We approved it because we didn't lower our standards and it met the bar. So that's clear and convincing evidence, lowercase e, that we are able to approve with what we have. But I think we need to learn more. And I think subsequent speakers will get into this. It's perhaps not surprising, but we'd rather see a credible incremental evolution whereby we get things right, rather than, and no one's proposing we rush and get things wrong, of course, but I think that's the risk. So I'll leave it to Congress and Cures 2.0, et cetera, but we are focused very intensively on honoring our commitments to 21st Century Cures and to PDUFA 6, and to making sure that any application we receive today, we do our best to look for its strengths. And of course, we're also obligated to identify its limitations and make clear and consistent decisions regarding what drug is safe and effective based on real world evidence, whether it's supportive, confirmatory, adequate and well controlled, or anywhere on that spectrum. Thank you. Okay,
so I have a couple of questions dealing with kind of how journalists should be looking at this and what they might be covering next. The first is, you mentioned the indication for Ibrance, the drug for men with metastatic breast cancer. You said at the time that actually got some media coverage. I mean, do you remember, did the media kind of describe and understand the nuances and the fact that this was real world evidence in this approval, or was it just this drug was approved?
Yeah, well, two things. One, I had just joined FDA and I wasn't in my current position, but that's not an excuse. I think I'll say that a better quote unquote excuse is that I don't remember each and every press, clipping, quote unquote, that I encountered. And it's also a question of what did the agency release? What did the sponsor release? I think in general, overall, there were some more accurate or the more detailed the report was in general, the more I would be satisfied as a purist linguistically, or, in terms of taxonomies. But in some cases, like the shorthand, like real world evidence used to approve Ibrance, it's no one's fault if that implies that, now all of a sudden we didn't need a clinical trial. But it's more than a technicality, but it is in one sense a capital T technicality that the FDA approved that indication. If you go into its Federal Code of Regulations 314.126 and 21 CFR, we need to identify what are the adequate and well-controlled studies? And part of the issue, the data sets had, it was the upwards of like, no more than a couple of dozen men with male breast cancer when you applied all the inclusion-exclusion criteria and other requirements to sort of match the patients who didn't get Ibrance. So in that sense, there was no chance for the real-world evidence to be adequate and well-controlled. But I would offer a forward-looking answer, to a new question would be if any of you encounter a situation where someone says, well, this is real-world evidence that is being used for a drug or a biologic or a device approval, you might want to at least early on scratch beneath the surface to say where on that continuum is the real-world evidence providing its support. Is it, because to be silly, the literature is real-world data. So every approval could be said to be real-world evidence if we really stretch things and say, well, we looked at an article and it's in the submission, therefore, there's real-world data involved, and that would be, not really meaningful. But there's a little bit of a flexibility in terms of what is and what isn't considered real-world evidence, or what role it had in the approval. Does that help, Chris?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Now, for the reporters who are covering this, we're looking for ways to take what is kind of a very technical regulatory issue and somehow make it so it's relevant for a broader audience and the journalists who cover health issues or maybe cover the drug industry or the FDA specifically. So could you just give us a heads up? You touched on this briefly, but what are like the next steps in the FDA's framework and FDA's review of this? I mean, what should journalists be looking for about what's going to happen next, which might be an opportunity for them to write about this?
Well, let me work in ascending order of sort of impact. I do want to mention the demonstration projects, and again, you'll hear more about that shortly. I don't know that each and every one will be like newsworthy as they're reported, but hopefully some will be. But I think, again, I use the description of like planting seeds and watching the field grow. I think we will get a lot of return on investment in terms of having better data collected at the bedside. Like there's an initiative to, right now, we do not blame clinicians for taking care of patients and putting down the data that they need. But one question is, wouldn't clinicians benefit from research-grade data? So there are initiatives to improve the quality of data collection at the bedside so that you don't have to look for so-called unstructured data in the notes. Because right now, claims data and electronic health data, the claims are all just for billing purposes mainly. And the electronic health record data, some of it you could gather from structured fields, others you have to go into the notes. I know this is sort of we need more time to really get into it. But I would say that we're going to get return on investment from the demonstration projects, perhaps more noticeably, but it will be, again, multiple, not one single instance. As FDA guidances are released, it won't probably be newsworthy, but we're looking forward to responses from stakeholders, feedback. They're released as draft guidances. We then hear from the field what they like, what they don't like, what they don't understand. And that should go a long way, again, towards helping raise the tide of the quality of real world evidence studies by having more clarity on what the FDA expects and also on what will be used in the review process. And I'm also not at liberty to speak about it, but the PDUFA 7 commitments are not public yet, but when that is released, that will include an update on negotiations that have concluded regarding how FDA and industry have looked to set new goals for the next PDUFA period.
Yeah, and just for the viewers, PDUFA, Prescription Drug User Financial Fees Act or something like that?
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah, that's where, it's renewed by Congress. But we have mandates in effect that align with 21st Century Cures. In this case, 21st Century Cures is wrapping up with its 5-year window. We don't have Cures 2.0, but we still have PDUFA 7. Sorry for the acronyms.
I want to thank you very much for your very detailed and excellent presentation and your thoughts. As I said to the viewers, you'll have access to the full presentation as well as the interactive transcript. And so I think it's some great information there for reporters who are covering this. So Dr. Concato, I want to thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, sir.